Professors FM.
I'm Bridget Stomberg.
And I'm Lisa DeSimone.
And this is Taxes for the Masses.
Today's episode dives deeper into one tax proposal that has come from both 2024 presidential candidates.
In June of 2024, presidential candidate Donald Trump proposed exempting tips from income tax. Approximately 2 months later, candidate Harris made the same proposal. In this episode, we discuss the current taxation of tips in the U.S. and highlight the potential ramification of proposals to exempt tips from income taxation.
Hello, B.
Hello, Lisa.
Somehow you've convinced me to record yet another episode about taxes in the context of this presidential election, and I'm not really sure how.
I promise it's not my fault.
It seems like your fault.
Not my fault. Maybe a little my fault.
I think entirely your fault.
Okay, so I know I personally have wanted to do an episode on tips for a long time, and I will say that candidates Harris and Trump just gave us/me that final little bit of motivation that we/I needed to actually put the episode together.
Yeah, totally your fault.
Okay.
And personally, I'm getting a little tired of the whole tipping culture that we have here in the US. You and I were just talking about this, right?
Yep.
I thought you agreed with me. So I can't decide what's stranger, that you want to talk about tips or that Harris and Trump are possibly agreeing on a tax proposal related to tips. Yeah, the whole thing's weird.
It is weird. So I couldn't agree more. To borrow a word from Tim Walz, it is weird. And I think the fact that Harris and Trump are potentially agreeing on something is definitely the stranger part of the equation
So
here.
weird. Yeah.
It's weird. I had to do a double take when I read it.
Yeah.
It's weird. Definitely that's weirder, not just because the two of them don't see eye to eye on much, but I think it makes perfect sense that I want to talk about tips because, as you know, I spent a decent chunk of my professional life dealing with the taxation of tips when I worked for P.F. Chang's.
Yeah, okay, that tracks. But yeah, what explains this bizarre world that we're finding ourselves in, that both Harris and Trump, who I don't think agree on very many things,
Nope.
have somehow come to the agreement that tips should be exempt from income taxation?
Stating the obvious here, but I'm not a political strategist or a political analyst or even someone who really cares about politics that much.
Stop caveating and just give your opinion.
It seems to me like this proposal is nothing but a play to garner votes from working class voters who happen to be in a restaurant, service, hospitality industry of some sort. But we're getting ahead of ourselves and swerving a bit out of our lane, which we don't want to do.
Yeah, because we're not really the ones that should be telling you why they're both
No.
proposing to not tax tips. But we can tell you something about the current state of taxing tips. So that's our first to do in our episode today. And how a proposal to exempt tips from income tax might affect revenues and taxpayers.
All right, so let's dive in and start with the current state of taxing tips. As we've said at least 10 times on this podcast, and I've probably said at least 100 million times in my life, the federal government wants to tax all of your income.
All of it.
All of it.
All of it.
Regardless of how you came upon it or what you call it.
All of it.
All of it. Unless there is a specific rule in the code that exempts some portion of your income from tax, Congress wants to tax all of it.
Yes. And currently, there is no exception for tips. So all tips received are included in taxable income, whether you receive them in cash or property or through some payment app like Venmo or PayPal. Tips are currently taxable.
And just to be clear, whether you're claiming that
Reporting them. Yes.
That's a different story. But in theory, if you're getting a tip for anything, you should be reporting it on your tax return.
Yes.
And the fact that tips are income and should be included on your tax return makes sense, I think. I'm optimistic that we can illustrate that with an example.
Okay, I like this idea. All right, so let's say B decided to quit her job as a tax professor and try her hand at waitressing in Indiana. And Dear God.
No.
Yeah. I pity the customers at that restaurant.
Nightmare scenario. Okay, continue.
By law, Indiana requires businesses to pay tipped employees a minimum wage of only $2.13 per hour.
Yikes.
And as long as B makes at least $5.12 an hour in tips, her total income, which is wages plus tips, is $7.25 per hour, which equals the federal minimum wage, and we're all good. Good so far?
I'm good so far, but I'm a little petrified to think that I'd have to earn $5.12 an hour in tips to just get to the minimum wage, but continue.
Like you would have to pay me in order to allow me to let you serve me at a restaurant. So I don't think that $5.12 is coming your way. But this is clearly a hypothetical example.
Clearly.
So B works for an hour at a restaurant as a server and earns her $2.13 from the restaurant itself. And let's say she miraculously manages to earn $20 in tips that hour, probably because she's dispensing tax advice instead of the correct plates and drinks that these people have ordered. Her total income for that hour of work as a waitress is $22.13, and that entire amount under current law is taxable. Congress has not yet decided that the tip portion of those earnings from taking orders and delivering food should be taxed any different than the non-tip portion.
Okay, so why propose to change this now? Like we said, this isn't our bailiwick, but others who are political strategists have suggested that this is, a play to appeal to the quote working class and a very specific segment of the working class, right? Mm-hmm. By making it seem like they would get a tax cut. Mm-hmm. And using the very simple example we just presented, that may seem true at first glance. So, I made $22.13 that hour. And if you don't make me pay tax on that $20 of tip income, you're only making me pay tax on $2.13 of my earnings that the restaurant gave me directly.
Right.
That seems like it's surely going to reduce my overall tax burden, right? If I only have to include $2.13 as opposed to $22.13, I mean, at first glance, that seems like a win for me from a tax perspective.
At first glance, however, the devil is in the details.
The plot thickens.
Yeah, let's look at the details a little bit more. The median wage for wait staff in the U.S. was about $32,000 in 2023. If you assume that person was a taxpayer who filed single, mm-hmm. they would owe about $1,900 in federal income tax if they didn't qualify for any credits like the earned income tax credit or the mm-hmm. child tax credit. And if that median wait staff person had a child, they would owe no federal income tax.
So that's right. And that's where this kind of sort of starts to fall apart a little bit. Even though that median wait staff that you referenced is currently including all of their tips in their taxable income. So right now, mm-hmm. under current law, they are quote unquote taxed on their tips. By the time you take into account the standard deduction and potential tax credit, it turns out that fully 50% of wait staff in the U.S., those who are at or below the median, might not currently owe any income tax at all.
Which is pretty interesting to figure out.
Yes. And to be clear, if you don't owe tax, then you can't do any better than that.
Right. Yes. This not taxing tips is not going to help that 50% of wait staff who already are not paying tax.
Correct.
All right. But that's just the median wait staff.
True.
Wait staff in high-end restaurants make a lot more in tips. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the top 10% of wait staff in the U.S. can make over $60,000 per year, most of that in tips. So not taxing tips could be a boon for them, right?
Absolutely. So when you want to evaluate this policy and you're sitting there thinking, is this good policy? Is this going to benefit me? Is this going to benefit someone I know? The question is, how many taxpayers in the U.S. would actually benefit from a proposal that exempts tips from income taxation? So what do we know about the answer to that question?
Well, Yale's Budget Lab did an analysis of the No Tax on Tips Act, which was proposed in the Senate in June 2024 by Senator Ted Cruz and others. So the data we have is coming from that report. The first thing to note is that there were roughly 4 million workers in 2023 who are in, quote, tipped occupations. And that's about 2.5% of the total workforce.
Correct. Thank you. So 2.5% of every person who is working in the U.S., only 2.5% are even in tipped occupations.
That's a pretty low percentage that this entire bill, this entire debate is targeting.
Exactly. And if we narrow in on the bottom of the workforce in terms of wages, and the Budget Lab did that by looking at those earning less than about $18 an hour.
Okay.
Tipped workers make up 5%. So when we focus on
okay.
the low income part of the distribution, tipped workers make up more, but still that's not a massive proportion.
Yeah. I mean, 5% is enough to tip this election, according to recent polls.
Excellent point.
But it's not we're not getting a lot of bang for our buck here.
No.
The Budget Lab goes on to estimate that about 40% of those tipped workers already pay no income tax, consistent with what we said a few minutes ago. That means that the other 60%, or perhaps as many as 2.4 million workers, could benefit from exempting tips from income tax.
Yeah. So if we do a little back of the envelope math, it seems like there are 4 million workers in the U.S. who are considered tipped, part of the tipped workforce. And currently 40% of them probably don't owe any income tax. So that's how we get to that 2.4 million number. And to your point, that is probably enough to influence this election. But for everybody else who's thinking about it, it is a relatively small percentage of U.S. citizens who are going to benefit from this provision.
Yep.
Did I get all that right?
You did. And I would say you deserve a tip. But I'm a little unclear now on what the tax implications of giving you that tip might be.
Me too.
All right, so first on our to-do list was to highlight the current tax treatment of tips. Easy peasy. We did that. It's taxable and we're done. Great. Next, we wanted to highlight who would be affected and how. And we came to the understanding that under the current state of the world, Yale's Budget Lab estimates that somewhere in the neighborhood of 2.4 million tipped workers could benefit from exempting tips from taxable income. And so now we're going to move on to some of the other consequences of such a policy change.
All right. So first up, and I think most obvious, are the revenue implications. There's no such thing as a free lunch. And so we have to talk about what it's going to cost to give the benefit to these workers. Because any policy that reduces taxable income, all else equal, is also going to reduce tax collections. The Tax Foundation estimates a lower bound cost of around $107 billion over the next 10 years if tips were to be exempt from income taxation.
And the problem is that estimate is almost certainly understated.
Interesting.
Why? Because if tips are suddenly tax-free, then service workers are going to be incentivized to structure their compensation so that more of their total comp comes from tips relative to wages.
That's exactly right, because now we're down to sort of a semantics issue. The $213 that I'm getting from the restaurant, still taxed. Whatever I'm getting from my customers, not taxed. So I want to make more of it come from my customers.
Exactly.
What's more, that $107 billion estimate assumes that tips are exempt only from income taxes. But former President Trump said in his speech, quote, "We are not going to charge taxes on tips." He didn't specify. If he actually meant income taxes and payroll taxes, then the revenue implications get far worse.
Do you think Trump knows what payroll taxes are?
I don't.
Okay. So recall that all income from employment and self-employment is subject to payroll taxes. And that's in addition to the income taxes that you pay at the federal and possibly at the state level. These employment taxes are an all-in rate of just over 15%. In that case, the Center for a Responsible Budget estimates the impact on federal tax revenues could be $150 to $250 billion over 10 years, assuming tips don't increase, which is the problem we were just talking about. They probably will.
Yep.
And it could be as much as $500 billion in a hit to our tax revenues if the amount of tip income were to double.
Yeah. And so based on what we've kind of researched for this episode, that the prospect of tips increasing under this proposal is kind of a place where people are not really loving this proposal.
Yeah.
So it's something that we need to carefully consider. And the thing that's tricky is it's not just in industries where tips are currently the norm, right? It's not just the restaurant worker or the hotel worker who could be trying to shift their compensation structure to get more tips. There's actually some concern that occupations where tipping was previously not customary would undergo changes to convert what used to be classified as a wage into a tip. So then I think it's maybe a good time to take a pause and define what a tip is.
Ooh, I agree. Okay. Let's see. The IRS defines tips as, quote, discretionary, which is optional or extra, payments determined by a customer that employees receive from customers, end quote.
Okay.
So let's say you're a tax accountant and you do a really great job preparing a tax return for a client. You have really neat work papers, timely delivery, excellent customer service. One could imagine a world where the client tips you for that exceptional service instead of paying you a fee, which would be taxable income as regular compensation, wages.
Exactly. So maybe last year I charged you $1,000 to do your return, and this year I say, hey, Lisa, I'm only going to charge you $800, but if you think I did a great job, feel free to tip me.
Because we've all seen those signs.
Yeah. So many have criticized this No Tax on Tips Act as not having enough guardrails in place to prevent specifically high income individuals like everybody's favorite hedge fund managers,
Oh boy.
lawyers, and other highly paid professionals from structuring their compensation to be categorized as tip income, kind of like we just said. That proposed law is not restricted to certain industries like the service industry or hospitality industry, and it places no cap on the amount of tips that could be exempt, which seems problematic.
Yeah, this seems really problematic. Every dollar of income that a high income individual could reclassify as tips would save them 37 cents in tax. And that's compared to only maybe 12 or 22 cents per dollar for lower income earners. And that's all based on what tax bracket they fall into. As we said before, for 40 to 50% of wait staff, they would get no benefit of changing their wages into tips because they don't pay taxes at all at their level of income anyway.
Right. So you can see that there's definitely an incentive for higher income earners to work the system here.
Yes.
And there's also a horizontal equity problem here. Horizontal equity, as we've talked about a little bit before, is a key principle of good tax policy. And what it means is that two taxpayers who are making similar amounts, equal amounts, they're similarly situated, should pay about the same amount in taxes, all else equal. And the horizontal equity problem in this case comes in two flavors. So we've got kind of a lot of potential for horizontal inequity with this proposal. First, there could be horizontal inequity across jobs paying the same total wage. So as we said earlier, 95% of people in low wage jobs would not benefit from this plan because they're not in what we consider tipped occupations.
Yep.
So let's say one worker earns $34,000 a year as a cashier who doesn't get tips, and another earns that same $34,000 per year as a tipped wait staff, and $15,000 of that comes in tips. Right now, they both pay about $3,400 in income taxes.
Okay. But under the no tax on tips proposal, the wait staff would receive a big tax benefit of $2,900, while that cashier who didn't get any tips gets absolutely nothing. Nada. Zip. Zilch. Nothing.
And that's pretty much a straight up violation of horizontal equity.
Yeah.
Second, there could also be horizontal inequity across states for the same job. Two wait staff. So remember that nightmare example you came up with where I was a waitress?
I do. I'm not going to be able to sleep.
So if I were a waitress in Indiana is only obligated to pay me $7.25 an hour total, wages plus tips. But in California, the minimum is $16 per hour. So if I waitress in Indiana and earn minimum wage plus $20 in tips, then like we said above, I've made $22.13 in total in that hour. And over 90% of that amount would be untaxed. But if I take my horrendous waitressing skills on the road to California,
God help us,
I would earn $36 total, 16 in wages and 20 in tips. And now only 55% of my income would be untaxed. And that is not fair because I'm paying tax on a different proportion of my income just as an artifact of where I live.
Okay, so I'm just speculating here, but maybe this is why candidate Harris floated the idea of not taxing tips in conjunction with the idea of raising the minimum wage at the federal level.
Yeah.
If every tipped worker in the U.S. faced the same minimum wage, you could at least reduce one of those forms of horizontal inequity that we just talked about.
I would like to think that that's why she put those two things together. We don't know, but I would like to think. Another thing that Harris has talked about that Trump was not explicit about, a Harris campaign official said that Harris would work with Congress to impose those limits and those guardrails and those other requirements to prevent high-income earners from currently untipped occupations like hedge fund managers from potentially taking advantage of this relief should the proposal pass.
So what's the solution?
Well, as always, it depends on the problem that you're trying to solve.
Okay.
If the goal is to provide broad tax relief to working class taxpayers, then a targeted provision like this one is going to fall short and leave many without relief.
Agreed.
Other tactics like raising the standard deduction, lowering statutory tax rates, or increasing the size of the earned income tax credit or the child tax credit would be much more far-reaching and benefit a wider swath of working class taxpayers.
And likely not create the potential behavioral changes that could cause a provision like this to balloon in terms of cost.
This is definitely a difficult balance to strike. All right, time for the good, the bad, and the ugly. And I'll start because I am very excited that we did finally get to do an episode on tips.
And it was mostly about tips and taxing tips and not about the election. So I'm not as nauseated as I thought I was going to be.
Excellent. I'll take it. Not as nauseated. I'll take it.
It's high praise.
Anything else you want to add?
Nope.
Okay. How about the bad?
So I guess technically Trump came out with this idea first, and then
Yes.
Harris also came out and said that she also supported the idea. And so Trump is now calling Harris, and I'm trying to use the way that he actually pronounces her name, which I think is incorrect, but he calls her copycat Kamala, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. Yes.
Because Trump and Vance clearly have some weird cat obsession, particularly when it comes to Harris, which I don't
Yes.
understand.
No, it's not great. The other bad thing, I didn't know to make it a good or a bad. I'll make it a bad, but the other bad thing, or maybe I will make it a good. Maybe I'll say the good thing is that I managed to go about 20 minutes without making a just the tip joke.
I'm very impressed. No further explanation is required. I think that gets us to the ugly.
Okay.
I think you took us there.
All right.
And it's just, I mean, we've said this before. We say it, I think, every time we talk about a policy. You really need to think carefully about who you want to actually benefit from a policy when you design the policy. Because if the intent is to provide tax relief to those who need it most, this is not the way to do it, because those who
Correct.
need it the most aren't going to get any tax benefit because they're not
Correct.
paying taxes already.
Correct. Please say that again, because I think that that is the most important point here.
I have no idea what I just said.
The people who need the tax relief the most are
Yes.
those below median, with kids, wait staff who are making $32,000 a year. This policy will not help them because they are already paying no tax.
I'm sure I said that.
It was eloquent. It was great. In this election cycle, what I would like to say, assuming it's well-designed, assuming it's a well-designed policy, then whether it's, quote, good or bad is a value judgment. If you would rather spend that $100 billion on something else, like a bigger standard deduction, like a bigger earned income tax credit or child tax credit, then maybe you wouldn't support this proposal because you want to spend that lost tax revenue on something different.
Yeah, I mean,
It's all trade-offs.
it's trade-offs and it's priorities, same as it is in our personal lives, right? Like,
Yes.
yeah, sure, there are tons of things that we would love to spend our money on, but we prioritize it so that we don't go bankrupt.
Exactly. We need to work on that as a federal government, but that is the theory.
Yeah.
In theory, we should be prioritizing the things we want to spend our money on so we don't go bankrupt. And this is going to drive you nuts. You can just stop listening. But I was on Trump's website I don't even know where I was. But he put in writing that Harris coming out and making this proposal makes her a hypocrite because she is contradicting, quote, the radical Biden-Harris position of wanting to collect more tax on tips. So he's trying to say that as vice president, she wanted to increase your tax on tips. And now, since he said it and it's such a great idea, she's doing a 180.
Okay.
My best guess at what he's referring to when he said that they were trying to collect more tax on tips was the IRS came out with something, I think it was about a year ago, called the Service Industry Tip Compliance Agreement. And what that was meant to do was to increase tip reporting.
Oh, compliance.
Compliance.
Yeah, in
Okay.
enforcing the laws that we already have in place.
Yes. Yes. So to be clear, did Biden and Harris have the radical idea of trying to make people pay the tax they owe under current law? Yes.
I think that's something Trump isn't a fan of.
No. Yeah, he's calling them out for trying to enforce the tax law. Mm-hmm. They were trying to cut down on tax evasion.
Good point.
Okay. That's all I got. Anything else?
Are we done talking about the election? Can we be done? Is it November yet? Can just ping me in November and tell me I can look at the news again, please?
Okay. I hope to be able to tell you that you can look at the news.
Well, that's all we have time for today.
Be sure to join us for more tax nerdery on future episodes of Taxes for the Masses.